you're talking about.
Yes. Happens all the time.
Would have been a good time. I think I could have been my life. It may never be forgiven. But that is just too bad. I need to leave. And I'm not free of the world. Yes, perhaps I should take it from him. I'm gonna do something. It's not a dream, but I've got time to stay there. Well, I still think you could be back on the table. It's a damn thing scared to say. Nothing is going to be a thing. And I'm the one who got on this rock with a child. And then I left the other two.
I just wanted to tell you that I was much better than you did. I had to stop him. I couldn't even tell.
All right, let's pause that nonsense there.
Okay, thank you for coming this afternoon. We are very excited to have with us Jonathan Blow, who's going to be talking about AI and game design. And I assume that most of you should work, but if you don't, he really had an influential role in the beginning of the indie game movement with the release of Braid. And earlier this year, he released his latest game, The Witness. Really, just really had a huge impact on the way that indie games have been viewed and indie games have been perceived by the consumers and by the broader industry. And so we're really excited to have Jonathan today talking about design and how his experiences in design relate into artificial intelligence. So I think I don't need to say anything more, but I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Let's have the obligatory test. Is the mic working here? I can't tell. Okay. All right, well, thanks everybody for showing up. I am going to say a few things about artificial game design as it relates to artificial intelligence or something. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of generating, not really talking about generating games as a whole, concocting game mechanics out of nowhere, but assume you have some set of, what do you do? How do you build levels and scenarios that? Not to say that what I'm going to say isn't relevant to the wider, harder problem. It's just find it useful to keep it discussion. Now, there are games out there in the world, procedurally generated stuff today that are very successful and that people like to play, but it's not really what you would call AI-generated stuff, right? They tend to be generated by simpler algorithms that are a little more straightforward. So here's two screenshots from procedurally generated games. On the left here is Spelunky, which is an action platformer, and every time you restart the game, it generates a bunch of levels, and it does some pretty simple things where it's got some templates for sub-sectors of this level, and then it randomizes them a little bit and puts them together in such a way that it knows that there's more or less pro path from the beginning to the exit that, you know, for the most part, you can straightforwardly follow, and then there's all these diversions off to the side with other interesting theme rooms like treasure rooms and shops and whatever. On the right here is Dwarf Fortress. This is sort of a world-sized map. The scale on which you would actually realistically play the game is much smaller, but because the guys who make the game are very enthusiastic, they like generate a whole world for your little fortress to be in. But again, it's not really what you would consider AI, right? It's just you know, we're going to make some terrain and some mineral deposits and whatever kind of code. Now, what I'm going to sort of assert right now and spend the rest of the talk justifying is that there's a difference here between sort of dumb generation and intelligent generation, right? So dumb generation is something that just meets some kind of functional targets, like, oh, we need to make sure there's a path from the entrance to the exit, or we need to make sure there's a certain amount of iron deposits in the world or something, that's all fine. But I'm going to claim right now that intelligent generation is something that knows what it's communicating. That's sort of the thesis of this whole talk, and knows what it's communicating, what even that means. I will now try and communicate. And I'm going to start by talking about 2D platformers, in part because they're easy to see. You can see the whole level on the screen at once, but also they're a very popular target. If people are going to make something that generates levels for games, often they'll pick a 2D platformer because it's sort of easy to think about how you would build that kind of a level. I happen to have made a 2D platformer, or designed it anyway, called Braid, and I'm going to use that for the beginnings of the discussion, because in this game, each level has ideas. Each level says something very strongly often, and this is going to help me introduce this idea of how games communicate. And then later on, we can connect that idea to some other games that are a little bit more subtle. So, Braid is a game where the main game mechanic, as we would say, is that you can manipulate time by rewinding, but it's organized into a, well, we'll get into the organization later. But for now, it'll suffice to say that each puzzle in every level has a specific idea, right? The puzzles are not arbitrary difficulty challenges. Each of them has some kind of rhetoric behind it, actually, but it's not a linguistic rhetoric. It's a conceptually felt rhetoric in some way. So this level is called Leap of Faith, and sort of what you have to do to get to later in the level is jump off the screen and fall down this pit. It is a sort of well-known thing among game designers that you must never do that when you're designing a platformer. Because if sometimes people have to jump down in pits to proceed, and sometimes they just die, then you've sort of broken the contract between designer and player. Like, people don't know what you expect of them, and you're going to frustrate them, and it's a terrible thing to do. However, the rhetoric going on here is like, oh, you know what, this is okay if you can rewind. If the mechanics of the game are that you die a lot and you're expected to rewind, then suddenly a leap of faith is like nothing. There's no cost to it. So that's like the idea. That's the whole reason there's this giant pit in this level. Here's another level called Hunt, where there starts out, there's 6 monsters in the level, and you're supposed to jump on them all and kill them all. And so I've got 4, as you see at the top of the screen there. But then, if you play this level in a straightforward way, you reach this time where you're like, oh, I need to try and jump across this gap to get to these 2 guys on the right, and you can't do it. And you're like, well, what's going on? I don't see any way that this is possible. And what's going on is that there used to be a guy down here in the middle of this bottom right platform who used to be there, and you jumped on it, right? So now the information on what you need to do to succeed has actually been taken out of the level by you yourself. And by rewinding, going back in time, you could get back to a time when that information is present again, right? So what is being communicated here is some idea about presence or absence of information. Here's a level called Phase. This is a sort of in the next world of the game where you still have your basic rewind ability, but also some objects are immune to being rewound. And there's an exploration that happens of what are the consequences of this. So in this level, there's a sort of a top row of clouds that behaves normally, and then the bottom row, which is sparkling green, which you can barely see, is immune to your rewind capability. And so by rewinding, you also change the phase of the top row of clouds relative to the bottom row of clouds. Thereby you can make a sort of a statically stable state where, in the big gaps in the top row, the clouds in the bottom row are sort of there and fill them, and then you can jump from cloud to cloud and get across. Here's yet another one. Oh, and this is just to say that the idea here, it's a showcase of this fact that you can phase shift things if they're moving at a constant speed, and you can rewind and they don't, right?
And then you go on further in this world and other ideas happen. We don't keep repeating this idea. Here's a level that's sort of a nod and a wink to Donkey Kong, but the reason that that happens is, this is in World 4, which is a level where now suddenly time is tied to your position. So in addition to rewinding, as you run to the right, time goes forward, and as you go to the left, time goes backward, and everything has this suddenly weird frozen feeling, because if you're standing still, nothing is allowed to happen, right? And so, as a designer, I wanted to make a situation where you really feel strongly, things only go forward when I go, and then they go backwards when I go left, and that's really weird. And so I made a level where you go right and left, which is sort of what Donkey Kong is about, which is why this took this form. But what is being communicated here to the player? Well, there's sort of two things. One is really showing the player the feeling of what happens when time behaves this way. But the second one is that now sort of certain things that wouldn't have been obstacles before are obstacles. So, you can get to one of these platforms, like let's say this one over on the right, and when I'm standing over there, it will always happen that this guy is on top of the platform. And I can't do anything about that. Normally it would be a time challenge where you just wait for the guy to walk off and then you run up. But now he's a static obstacle that will never, the way the timing works out is he will always be there, and now you have to find a different way up to the top. So it's interesting, right? Now, that's a kind of communication, that idea is a kind of communication that happens sort of at the scope of an entire level, right? It's why the level is there in the first place, is to explore that idea. But then within levels, there can be many smaller nuances. So, this hunt level has an example of one of those. Like I said, I as a player would like to get to the right-hand platform there, but I don't seem to be able to. I keep trying to jump, and as far as I go, this is sort of the arc of my jump. As I try, even if I go toward the very end of the platform and jump, I'm pretty far from the edge of that next platform. Now, there are two things happening here. One of them is a functional requirement, right? So I've designed a puzzle game. I have a puzzle, and this solution is wrong, and there's another solution that I'll show in a second is right. And for this solution to be wrong, the gap has to be too wide for you to jump. But that's not that doesn't tell me completely how wide the gap should be, right? I, as a designer, have to make a decision, how wide is this gap? Which is where the communication part comes in. Because it's important not only that the player can't solve this puzzle, but that the player understands that this is not the correct approach to solving this puzzle, right? Because imagine if either this platform came out further to be under the guy's feet, or this came out further, and you almost could make it, right? If you really ran to the edge, then you would be encouraging a behavior like, well, I don't see what else to do. This must be the way to do it. It must be a really finicky timed puzzle, so I've just got to keep trying over and over. And people will run to the edge and jump and miss, and run to the edge and jump and miss, and they'll get really frustrated, and they'll hate your game, and they will hate you, right? So what you do, what you do is you make it wide enough so that when I'm falling through there, there's really, as long as I'm a reasonably perceptive player, there's no mistake. It's like, yeah, I can't possibly, I'm like 2 player widths or 1.5 from the edge of that, and that's for me jumping from the very edge of the platform. Now, that's a constraint wherein you want that gap to be wide, but there's also a constraint wherein you want it to be narrow, right? Because the actual solution to the puzzle, if I go back and do it the right way so that this guy is still alive and I can bounce off him, that's a bit of a finicky dexterity requiring maneuver, and people may fail that the first 1 or 2 or 3 times, right? But when they try it, so again, there's a functional requirement, which is that since this is supposedly the right answer, that this has to be possible, right? So that means, if the ledge, or if the gap was so wide that you couldn't do it, then it would fail that functional requirement, right? But there's also a communication issue again, which is that, this guy is kind of a moving target, he's going back and forth, and you're trying to judge when you want to jump, and it's very easy to sort of hit him early and bounce up and maybe not air control that well, and you miss this platform. But when you do that, it should feel like, oh yeah, that was really sloppy. I could easily hit that if I just did the same thing that I'm doing now correctly, right? The player has to have that idea. If they don't, if they try it and they don't feel like it worked any better than the previous thing they were trying, then they're going to go try something else. They're going to have seen the right answer and been like, oh, that must not be it, and go off and do other things. So, and this is part of what tuning a game is. Often when people start talking about level generation and like, we're going to tune the level so it's just right, they're usually thinking about difficulty or something. But actually, tuning is, for experienced designers, tuning is not so much about difficulty. It's a lot more about communication with the player and making it clear to the player what the level is about, what is expected from them, and making sure that they don't get bogged down in things that are frustrating and dumb. Now, okay, so that was an example of ideas that come into play in tiny aspects of a level, right? Nuances of a level. But then there's also ideas, continuity of ideas from one puzzle to another within the same level. So here's that phase level again that we were just looking at. And assuming you solve that, or even if you don't, just to the right of it on this level, there's a more sophisticated version of the same puzzle. The difference being, in the one on the left, you could set up the clouds in a static situation where once they're in position, you can just jump, 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 and go. In this one on the right, you can't do that. There's only one cloud in the bottom row, so even if you set this up in the right place, you jump on it, you get to this one over here, and then there's nowhere to go, right? There's no static situation that will solve the puzzle. So you as a player have to realize, like, oh yeah, I can rephase shift anytime, and I can do it while I'm in the air even, possibly, jumping off this cloud to land on a new one that fills that gap. So again, there's an idea. It's the idea that the phase shift can happen any time, right? You don't have to set it up and then go. Even if you're messing up right in the middle of the thing, you can just keep rewinding until the thing is in the right place. There's a continuity now. There's, idea A leading to idea B. Here's that Donkey Kong level again. Just to the right of it, on there is another zigzagging left and right structure. You would like to avoid it and maybe just run to the end of the level if you didn't want that puzzle piece, but again, there's another static obstacle, right? Normally these plants move up and down, but this one will just block you because time is frozen if you don't move. So your only choice is to go left, up, left, up, and try to do some things up there. But because because these obstacles are moving, some of them to the left and some of them to the right, but moving at different speeds and densities, it's sort of like a restatement of the problem in the earlier puzzle, but it becomes different. It becomes more about dodging things that are moving at constant speed that don't appear to be moving because time is frozen. But as soon as you try to run forward to jump over this thing, it's going to come at you, right? So again, there's individual ideas connected, which makes them bigger ideas. So the game as a whole is structured in some way where there's sort of 6 major worlds. And each world has an overall concept that organizes everything, all the puzzles that are in that world. So in World 5, every single puzzle has something to do with there being a parallel universe when you rewind. If there isn't, it doesn't go in World 5, right? And then every individual level has usually just one idea, and this is not a complete list, these are just examples. So if you look at the game in terms of what it communicates, it's some kind of overall structure, like all this stuff. Now, that organization is what helps the players see and understand the ideas, right? If I went back and took this chart and said, like, you know what, I don't want to organize my game this way, I'm just going to take the parallel universe puzzles and scramble them among the rewind exemption puzzles and the reverse time puzzles and all that stuff, then you get something very different. It becomes much harder to read the game as a player. It becomes much harder, in storytelling, this is a little bit of a diversion, but in storytelling, there's a way that you sort of feel the momentum of a story of what's happening and where it's going, and you're like riding along with it, right? this is not a linear story kind of a game, but there's a similar thing where there's an evolution of the concepts, and you understand that as a player, and you're riding along with it. And if you were to take all these puzzles and scramble them, you muddle the communication such that it's not really possible any longer to ride along with it. And the experience, let's just say, it would be very different. It would be a much less strong play experience. Now, in addition to all that, there's another level of stuff that happens, which is cross-references and callbacks across levels. So you might reach a particular level and it'll say, hey, do you remember this other thing you did before? Do you see how this thing you're doing now relates to that other thing? So again, here's phase again. And that level is reprised in world 6 with only one row of clouds, where in that world you have this mechanic where you can set up a little time dilation. And you do that, and one cloud is more slowed down than the other one, and so step by step you can inch your way over to the right by jumping from cloud to cloud and setting up your little dilation thing there. So the solution is not really very much like the one from the earlier world, but the situation is. Here's that hunt level again. It's reprised in world 4, again where time is frozen unless you move. And this one's very interesting because you have to still use your earlier solution of bouncing off this guy, but now it's a lot more complicated because if you ever walk left past a monster that's dead, he'll come alive again. So you have to figure out an order in which to stomp on all these guys such that you do it left to right and yet manage to get all of them because, for example, once you get rid of this guy, you can't get up there again to the right. So that's pretty interesting. Now, these are not just, academically nice things about the game, right? It's meant that the player notices these, at least to some degree, while playing. Some players have a much more solid grasp of what a game is doing when it communicates this kind of a thing. But all players get it to some degree, and it's why games work a lot of the time. And I will say this kind of a thing is what makes a handcrafted game not feel like a bunch of generated levels. That's sort of where I'm going with this, right? If you just have procedurally generated stuff, there's certain things that tends to lack. And what is it? And if you were going to make an AI that's better than vanilla procedural generation, what does it have to do? And my claim is that it's something to do with this kind of communication that I've highlighted before. But I want to substantiate that by not just talking about my own games, so we'll talk about some other ones. This is a game called VVV by Terry Kavanaugh. Some people call it V for short, but I, for some reason, like to say Coin. So in this game, you control this little blue guy you see in the middle of the screen. He cannot jump. Your main mechanic of moving around in this game is to flip the direction of gravity that applies to your character. So if you're walking along over here, say, and you wanted to jump over there, you actually run off the ledge and flip gravity and land upside down on the ceiling, which has now become your floor, and vice versa. And that's a very interesting design, and you get lots of interesting levels out of that sort of have this property of which way is up, I don't know, that you see here. Now, like Braid, VVV has an organization to its ideas that helps convey what's going on to the player and helps the player understand what's expected of them and anticipate what's coming next. So here's a shot of the world map of this game. And the overall plot of it is that there's 6 crew members that you have to find and rescue, and each one of them is located in one of these colored regions, right? So there's one in the blue region, one in the purple region, one in the yellow, and so on. And each of those regions, in addition to just having a crew member, has its own permutation of the game mechanic, or its own little addition that happens to that gravity flippingness. So, for example, in one of the regions, what happens is, hey, there's these vertical beams placed in the level, and if you cross over one of them, gravity will flip for you whether you wanted it to or not, right? And what does that mean? What happens and what kind of challenges occur under that structure is sort of what the game goes to explore, and it does that 6 times in 6 different zones, and then it puts them all together at the end. Oops, I just hit the wrong key and exited my slideshow. So now those two games are, we'll come back to VVV in a minute, but those games are very organized structures. But that is not necessary for a game to be heavily communicative. I'm going to go to another 2D platformer and play what is probably my favorite level of any game ever, and show the way in which this game communicates, even despite the fact that it is not nearly so organized. Or that it's organized maybe along more traditional lines, like how difficult are things, or whatever. So this is the fun part where I play the video game live and see what happens. Because what I want to do is go through this level and sort of explain everything that it's doing. Are we? Should we get Mike back on the?
Just working, sure.
All right. So I don't know why it's not starting. There we go. So I'll turn that down a little. This game was originally called Von Hawkins and the Thousand Spikes, and then it was remade by a company called Nicholas a couple years ago. This game, 1001 Spikes. And it's a, as you might glean from the name, it is a difficult platformer. I can go to sort of an earlier level and just, I don't even remember, I don't know. It's just, so crazy stuff happens, and you try to stay alive. So that's not the level I want to show. That's a good level, but my favorite level in the world is this one. This is an amazing tour de force of game design. If you can design something like this, you're just amazing, right? So prior to this level, you've seen spikes happen, and you've seen spikes that pop up and down, but you've never seen this like hellscape of spikes that's everywhere. And the first impression is like, oh my God, what am I dealing with, right? But you look on the screen, and again, the game is communicating to you right away. There are things placed such that you are intended to notice them. So at the bottom middle of the screen, if you can see that, there's a spot with a plant and no spikes. So that's very interesting. I guess I'm supposed to go there. It's pretty wide. It's 2 squares wide, so I should have a decent chance. I have to sort of jump down into these timed spikes while they're down and get there, and I'm thinking maybe I can jump at the end to give myself a little extra time in the air to stay away from the spikes. So I can try that. And okay, I made it, so that's good. Now I see over out to the right, there's another space, but it's smaller, so it's related to what I just did, but we're ramping up the challenge, right? It's like, okay, I've got to fit in this smaller space, and it's kind of treacherous to try and jump into it like I just did, partially because I'll miss the small space, but partially because now there's spikes overhead, right? So that's intimidating, so I'm just going to run for it, and I made it, thankfully. Okay, so now I can see on the right what appears to be another safe space. It's 1 block up from my current level, but I feel like I can get to that now. And actually there's a lower space that also doesn't have spikes, so I don't feel too worried about this. Now I've played the game enough to know right beneath that flamethrower on the right is the exit of the game. It's a little bit, it might be hard to see in the light, but it's sort of a dark rectangular doorway down there between the 2 spikes. I know that that's where I'm trying to get, and often pushable blocks look like this one that's right to the right of me. So it's this kind of a funny situation where it's like, oh, if I could just push this block, I would be done with this level. But I can't push the block, right? I have to go back and around. So there's a little bit of a joke here. We're going to come back to that because that's kind of important. But now, so in this game, you have a jump that works discretely. So my regular jump is exactly 1 square. Notice no matter how long I hold the button, I'm going up exactly 1 square. I also have a high jump that's 2 squares and some change, right? So I can't, this is the first time where I kind of need to use the double jump to get up there in this level, or double height jump. And that's a little bit intimidating because I kind of have to time this jump upward and to the left in order to make that timing window, but let's give it a try. And And we make it to this safe space. Notice that I can see the safe spaces, right? It's not like I'm running into the void, which would be sort of like a leap of faith, right? I see where I'm trying to get, and then I'm going to go there. Now this is a little intimidating again, because I have to get up a level, and if I jump too early and I bang my leg against that block on the left, then I'll fall into the spikes right when they're coming up, right? So again, I've got to time that jump, and oh, all right. So now we've got another one of these rectangular blocks, but it's not a safe space all of a sudden. These have been safe spaces so far. Now it's not. It's a change in the sequence. And it's like, oh my God, what do? I can't necessarily run across a field of spikes that long. I'm going to have to jump for it, right? So hopefully I can do this. I'm sitting here and watching the timing, and I'm going to go as soon as I can, and I'm going to jump as soon as I feel like the spikes are going to get me. All right. So now I have to get up and through some spikes and get to that safe space above me up there. It's a little bit intimidating because I can't build any horizontal momentum in the jump now, which makes it different from the previous jump, right? It's the previous jump plus no horizontal momentum, but then I have to create the horizontal momentum once I'm up there and get to that safe space. So I do that. And oh God. All right. Well, now I have a problem. I really can't make it. Look at how many spikes there are. I really can't make it across all that. However, I may figure something out at this point, or it may take several deaths to figure out. But it's like, wait, if there's no roof over my head like this, my jump is actually longer than the spike timing, so I can survive indefinitely in a place like this. Which is now suddenly a shift in my realization as a player that's being encouraged by the game design. It's like, wait, I could have done that at any time. I could have done that in those spikes down there, right? I could have done that even in this row to my right that I just jumped out of. I could have just sat down there. I would have to do the low jump, but I could do that indefinitely. It's also long enough. It's a little bit harder. So I'm sticking with the high jump so that I don't... It's notoriously hard to play games when you're giving speeches, so I'm sticking with the high jump. So now, I feel like I could at least get over far enough to where, maybe I can jump again into that gap. Maybe not. Maybe I should try and use the low jump. I don't know. Let's just give it a try and see if I die or not. So I get up there, jump, getting my courage together. Oh, I almost died there. All right. Oh, I went for low jump because I didn't quite make it. But so see, now I have this understanding, and now there's another square to my right that looks like a safe space, but it's really spikes that are waiting to poke up and get me. So it's really best not to stop there. And now I make it to the real safe space, which was off the screen from the point on the left where I started. This is the first time where the game demands that you run through all this stuff. And that fact that it's the first time makes it interesting. All right, so now I see that key. I know that key is the way to the exit. I need to get it to open the door. And, well, I can't jump that high, so I need to get that block over on the right. Wow, and this block is in a sea of spikes, so I have to kind of come down and push it, and come up and not get killed, and come down and push it, and now I've got the thing. So usually I enthusiastically run toward the exit, and then I realize, oh God, I can't get up there. So I need that block that I just pushed over there. And I need to push it back where it started. Okay, and then I can make it out. Now let's see, since I'm at the end, let's see if I can actually survive the level. High jump, fall, drop, high jump, yeah. Oh! I was standing at the door and then I accidentally pushed it right instead of up. That's what happens when you get talks. Okay, this is just to highlight how many ideas are going on in this level. Like, I went out once and diagrammed it all, and there's like 15 things or something, or 16 things. It's amazing, right? It's my favorite thing ever. That said, not a lot of people understand this consciously about games when they play them, right? Maybe we'll get back to that in a second. But it's just to say, that was not completely unique. to that game. Like every level in the game has stuff like this, has this kind of ideas. That's the highest density one, though, right? And if you look at that sequencing of ideas and the way they develop and take turns and give you surprises and stuff, like how different is that from the feeling of any procedurally generated or AI generated platformer that you've ever seen? It's very, very different. At least I feel that way. Now, the reason I wanted to harp on that so much is that it's easy to play a game like this and just, sort of look at these levels and say like, oh yeah, it's just a game with some hard traps, whatever. I can sort of generate a level with some hard traps and then do some brute force or heuristic solving to make sure that it's, playable to some degree, and then that's my level generator, right? Well, not really, right? There's a lot of intelligence that goes into this, right? And there's a lot of, there's a contract between the designer and the player that the designer must communicate all these things to the player, because otherwise, in something with this many requirements on what you have to do, where you didn't have a good understanding of the situation, it would be super frustrating and horrible and difficult to play, right? This game is very, very good about visually signposting what it expects from you, which is something I've never seen procedurally generated levels do. Here, this is not a new idea, I want to say. This is a still frame from a YouTube video by Aaron Hansen where he's talking about Mega Man X, which I guess was a Super Nintendo game. I don't know, I didn't play Nintendo, except at a friend's house. Anyway, he goes into quite some detail about this sequence where you've just beaten sort of the first boss monster, and it falls into a seemingly arbitrary place, what's very interesting is that place leaves a gap that's 2 squares wide, and that then deepens into a 1 square wide gap along this wall. And the way in which this space, which most people would look at and not think is anything but randomness, is actually a very, very smart insurance policy to make sure that the player understands the sort of wall sliding mechanic that's present in the game. Again, I just encourage you to watch that. He goes into great detail about it. But again, if a small feature like that can be very positive in terms of telling the player things and pushing them through the game, you can also infer that if you have spaces like that aren't meaningful, you're sort of throwing noise into whatever potential communication your level design might have. And so you need to sort of think about every tiny ramification of every piece of your level geometry in an intelligent way. So now, I felt like I had another slide in there. Yeah, let's do this one. Now, I mentioned during this playthrough that this block in 1000 Spikes is a kind of a joke, right? You see it. If you didn't understand anything about the game, and you just saw someone standing on this block next to this block with the exit there, you'd be like, you wouldn't know what any of those things meant, right? And you'd just be like, that's a screenshot of a game, who cares, right? But if you play it, and you've been in it, and you've done all these levels, then it's funny, right? So the game is telling you a joke, right? Anytime someone can tell you a joke, that is a quite sophisticated and subtle communication, right? Jokes don't always work. They require nuanced delivery, and they require, well, nuance. We'll leave it at nuance, right? So I want to go through a couple of other examples of jokes that are successful in games. So there's one in VVV, starting in this room called Doing Things the Hard Way. Where's my VLC? It's not open. It's not open. All right, so in this level, I guess I'll put some audio on. In this level, you, again, are still this blue guy. This is a save point, thankfully. On the right here is a shiny trinket, which is a collectible that you really want. There's a small number of them in the game, I don't know, like 20 or something. And so they're really valuable and you want to collect them. Standing between you and the trinket is a tiny 1x1 block. You can't jump. So you're like, well, what do I do? If you try to run up against that, it's like a wall cheat, right? So the only thing that you can do is reverse gravity and fly upward and just hope that just beyond the top edge of the screen, you can land on something and bounce back down just like you usually do. And when you do that, here's what happens. You get this very long, crazy, amazing spikes where you then have to bounce off the top and then come down again, and you usually die. It is not uncommon for people to try this for 200 lives. I think it took me over 200 lives to do it, because the controls are a little sensitive, and trying to do all these lefts and rights is very difficult. This guy eventually does succeed, so I guess we'll watch it all the way through. It's about another 30 seconds.
Getting frustrated.
Yeah. Now, the other thing you'll note is that one of the things that makes it a joke is the absurdity of that 1x1 square down there, right? Now, you could, if you were trying to be a good game designer and communicate effectively, right, you might put that shiny trinket on a pedestal that is higher than the height of the player. I think this is the one where he makes it. Yeah. Of course, the first time I did that, I actually landed on the wrong side. So going back to the screenshot, your first thought as a game designer might be, well, I want to emphasize that you can't get to this thing yet, so I'm going to put it up on a pedestal that's like higher than your head to make sure that you feel like you can't jump up there. That's what you would do in a classical jumping platformer. But it's the absurdity that this is the smallest possible obstacle in the game that makes it funny. Right? So it's a joke in the language of the game that you've come to learn. If you hadn't, I guess you guys thought it was kind of funny right there, but it's more funny, I think, when you actually understand the game at a deep level, right? Because your first thoughts upon seeing that are just like, yeah, I'm maybe going to flip up and just down like I just have 100, 500, 1,000 times on every challenge before this. Now, there is a sort of an intro that makes that, we won't rattle on that. All right, so let's talk about some things that aren't 2D platformers. The most recent game that I designed, The Witness, is also heavily built around this idea of communication, where you play the game and you wander around and you find these puzzles, and the puzzles have symbols in them and you don't know what they mean when you first encounter them, unless you read a cheat site, which hopefully people don't do. And the first time you encounter this array of panels, all of these would be off, and you only really see the first one, right? And the first one is just like, the idea behind it, the rhetoric that it's giving you is just like, okay, there's these things, black and white spots. And you don't know what to do, but there's only like 3 possibilities, so you try 3 things, and one of them is right. And so the idea is, well, maybe I need to draw a line between those, right? So the next one is only very slightly different from that. It's like, well, there's black and white spots, and your line doesn't have to be straight, it can curve around them. Okay, well, now there could be more than one black spot. Oh, and they could be arranged in a 2-dimensional array. Oh, there could be arbitrary groupings of these of arbitrary shapes, right? So we're starting with one idea and developing a more sophisticated understanding of these in a continuum, right? Oh, depending on where the start is and where the exit is, it might matter which direction you try to go around these. Because if you try to go around this one the same way you did here, you block the exit and you can't finish the puzzle, right? Oh, by the way, there can be disjoint sets of these and blank squares that you might think about. Do you want to associate the blank square with one color or the other, right? And again, the disjoint sets make the winding order matter in a way that it wouldn't have mattered just for non-disjoint sets. And then the last one here is kind of a joke, because I've been training up the player to recognize these successive patterns and understanding that these are disjoint sets and that they're separated from these, and then the solution to this one is that they're not disjoint, right? So it's a little bit of a gotcha there. The funnier joke in The Witness, I think, is this one, which is completely meaningless to anybody who hasn't played the game, or hasn't even, you could have played all the rest of the game, but not played this particular area, the logging area, and you just don't particularly know this is like nonsense, right? If you haven't played any puzzles before this, but if you have, then you start playing and you're like, wait a minute, and a funny situation happens, right? So anytime, I guess I've already said this, but the point of all this is just, you know, if my thesis is that a great deal of communication happens through level design, part of the proof that I have for that is that people understand these jokes. You know, whether or not you think that they're funny, you at least get it. You get like, oh, I see what you're trying to do there. And a joke requires a great deal of subtle context preceding it. Now, not all games are as ordered as the ones that I've showed so far, or have such a direct style of communication, but all games communicate to some degree, right? And we'll come to some more games in a little bit and elaborate on what I mean by all games communicating to some degree. But let's ask, what does this mean for AI, right? What, you know, if I'm going to try to make some AI that builds levels, like what are the ramifications? Well, the reason I'm hammering so hard on this word communication is because I want to suggest an approach where I think it would perhaps be fruitful to approach level design as a problem in natural language generation, right? So here I'm making an analogy between a level of a game and an utterance in natural language, right? So natural language generation is like you've got some database of facts or some information that you want to convey, and you know, it's represented in some not very human understandable form, and you want to generate a sentence, for example, in English or some other human language that seems natural and that communicates effectively to people, right? And you know, natural language generation is its own whole subfield, and there's all kinds of interesting things going on there. So what I want to say is because game levels, the thing that makes them feel good is this human element of communication, then the generation of that level can be profitably treated as if you were generating an utterance in a natural language, right? The utterance is a weird word, and you know, it's used, I think, primarily to emphasize that it's not necessarily, you know, a completely structured, well-formed English sentence all the time. Like, people speak naturally and sometimes just a couple words or a phrase or something, right? So utterance is just a more general way of saying something like a sentence, right? So an utterance is an expression of some internal ideas that the speaker had, and then they just say some things, right? But the internal ideas came first, right? The thing that they were going to say did not necessarily exist a priori without the internal desire to communicate that generated the utterance, right? So now, what I want to say about this is that a lot of times when people make, you know, level generators, their primary concern is playability, and that's a pretty good thing to be concerned about. But that's kind of just the minimum. So if you've done that, you actually haven't gotten very far in terms of something being intelligent, because, you know, relatively boring algorithms can do this stuff, right? And the analogy I want to make here is that playability of a level is like the syntax of a sentence, right? The syntax of the sentence has to be valid English syntax or close enough that people understand it, right? So if the level geometry and I want to include level geometry and actual game mechanics of things in the level, along with this idea of syntax. I'm calling all that syntax, right? Some people, if you try to make this syntax semantics metaphor about game levels, would say, well, you know, maybe the syntax is the game design, and the semantics is like whatever particular mechanics come into play. So if there's a little gravity reverser beam on this level, that's the thing. I don't agree. I think that's all syntax, right? The semantics of this game level utterance are all the things that the player didn't understand before playing the level that they now do understand after the level. And then, of course, that varies per player because effectiveness of communication varies depending on who you're communicating with, right? But so the semantics of a game level, then, under the definition that I'm putting forth, are actually pretty subtle. They're more subtle than semantics of linguistic communication, say. So, you know, these 15 or 16 circle notated things are the semantics of the level, right? So when I circle, say, this big gap, right? I would say the syntax of that is maybe that there's a gap in the level. The semantics is what that means for my ability to navigate the level as a player. And I know that the words syntax and semantics are overused. I think everyone uses them to mean different things, but it was the closest thing that I could figure out to what I wanted to say today. So I'm just going to keep using those, right? Now, imagine that you're doing natural language generation, and you're just generating sentences that are more or less good syntax, but have no real semantics or have random semantics, right? You wouldn't really call that intelligent output. And people don't want to read that kind of sentence. Like, nobody's going to really sit down and read an exciting novel full of sentences with random semantics, right? And you saw an example of such a thing in this video that we played before the talk. It's a video where some guys threw a bunch of science fiction scripts into a neural network and had the neural network generate a script. And they did a pretty good job of learning the syntax, but the actual lines are complete gobbledygook. The video is pretty amusing to watch. Like, I enjoy watching it, but all of the amusement comes from what the actors and the directors did with this ridiculous script of complete nonsense. Like, they found ways to try and make it make sense sometimes. But the actual script is, let's just say, this method of script generation is not going to replace actual screenwriters anytime soon. Something else might, but this won't. So getting back to the idea of some games communicating more than others, I want to contrast these examples of Sudoku versus Picross. Hopefully you're familiar with one or the other of these. So in Sudoku, you've got a grid of numbers, and the red ones aren't there, it's the start, those are just empty spaces, but the black ones are there, and you know some basic rules about what the numbers have to add up to and so forth, and or that there's one in every row and column or whatever. And you sit there and you figure out what knowledge you have based on those constraints, and bit by bit you solve more and more puzzle and put more numbers into place, right? In Picross, on the right here, it's a very similar thing where I have a row of sequences of numbers that sort of tell me something about how many pixels are in that column in some particular order. And then vertically over here, we have numbers that tell me how many pixels are living in that row in any particular thing. And so from a sort of game mechanical way of looking at this, if you're just going to look at it mechanically or functionally, they look the same, similar, right? In that you're solving constraints. But the thing on the right is a lot more communicative and requires intelligence to create, I think. And the thing on the left, Sudoku generators are a dime a dozen. You can download a trillion of them off the internet before you go home. But Picross generators, you could certainly find some that you give it the picture and it tells you some numbers that'll make that a puzzle. But actually figuring out what's a good Picross picture is very, very hard. If you were a human being and you came along and you solved one and it was some random static or a square or something, that would be very boring and stupid, right? So the fact that this is a duck is part of what's nice, right? And how do you know it's a duck? There's this weird thing where there's a small number of pixels that's supposed to connote the outline of the wing, right? This is a very abstract representation. So how would you start with the idea of a duck and then make a program that does that, that's not just referencing a database of pre-simplified icons or something, right? So that's where the intelligence comes from, right? So the joy of playing Picross is from the player slowly revealing the picture, and which coincidentally or not coincidentally is the hard part of generating that puzzle, right? So what I want to say is the communication that has to take place is the intelligence. Right? So you have two games that are similar. One communicates a lot more, is also a lot harder to apply AI to, which is not to say you can't, it's just harder. It's also not to say that Sudoku doesn't communicate. It does a very little bit. Hard Sudoku puzzles have little tricks in them that you may encounter for the first time and delight in or come to understand, but the more and more of them that you play, the less frequent that happens. Now in The Witness, there are some randomly generated puzzles. I did not try to generate them in a particularly intelligent way. The place that these happen in the game is that there's a speed run, which is a time trial, and it's supposed to be very challenging, and the puzzles are randomly generated so that you can't just memorize the answers and then get through it really fast, right? So they're different every time, and I validate, when I generate them, I validate that they're solvable, or at least that the ones that I want to be solvable are solvable. But I don't try to put meaning into them, right? In part because it was a huge game and we had to finish it, and that was way too hard of a problem, right? But also, let's just say this. The fact that I did not attempt to put meaning in them is also why they're relegated to a small portion of the game, right? So these puzzles that are randomly generated feel very, very different to play than these puzzles that are highly communicative. If you played the game, hopefully you know what I mean, right? There's this sequence of surprise and delight that can happen with this kind of puzzle very often. It happens very rarely with these. If it happens with these, it's more like luck, right? So it would have been very easy for me if most of the puzzles in the game could have been randomly generated. It would have saved me a lot of work. But the fact is they would not have been nearly as good. Even just for super, super abstract things, like, right, most people would look at something like this and say, oh, it's like abstract logic problems, you can generate those. But you actually can't. Not and do as good of a job as a human at this time. All right, so let's talk about games that are even less rhetorical than the ones that we've talked about so far. And I want to say that communication matters in those too, right? So it's often, there's an idea that people have that, like, okay, I'm going to design some levels, they need to be balanced, right? And the first idea that comes to mind about balance is just, okay, there can't be a dominant strategy, you know, if it's multiplayer, like, people have to win approximately an even amount of the time or something. So a game like that might be Counter-Strike. You might go into it with the mission statement, okay, I'm making a level for a balanced multiplayer shooter. Here's a very classic Counter-Strike map called Dust, where the terrorists start on the right and they're trying to run to the left to plant a bomb, either at point A down here or B up here. But to do that, they either have to go through this giant bottleneck, which is the most common place to go. There's a side thing, but we're going to ignore that for now. The idea behind this map is that it's a very tough time for the terrorists because they can get into this bottleneck very easily, but they can't get out before the counter-terrorists are in place. The counter-terrorists have all these exits within view, within seconds of exiting their base. So it's a tough time, and the terrorists have to really work together to get to one of these sites, usually A, sometimes B if they're trying to surprise people. This is very different from what you would get, I think, if you started randomly generating a Counter-Strike map and then, added and removed rooms and passageways until the win-loss ratio came to 50-50, right? Because the reason this is a strong map is because it does this crazy thing that no other map does. Most Counter-Strike maps are not like that at all. Here's one called CS Italy, which, again, for time constraints, I could talk for 15 minutes about what's interesting about this level. To do it in 30 seconds, I'll just say that it's an interesting organization of different lengths of sight lines, right? So on the right hand here, you've got this very long tunnel that leads right toward where the hostages are being captured, but it's usually dominated by snipers sitting in that window, possibly with a counter sniper down here. All these middle regions are not quite as long, and so they tend to favor people with assault rifles and such. And then there's a few close quarter regions like here and here where submachine guns are really the things that you want to have. It feels very intentional. And even though the map is not, or the game design or any of that is not built to communicate to the player as directly as those platformers that we were looking at, nevertheless, you find as you play the game, you come to understand all these things, right? You come to understand these ideas and this structure and this organization. And if those ideas weren't there to begin with, you wouldn't have really anything to understand, right? So even though Counter-Strike is not rhetorical, the levels are still an expression. They're an expression of what makes a good Counter-Strike map. right? So the last thing I want to say about tuning, coming toward the end here, I'll go a couple minutes over time, but the last thing I want to say about tuning is, again, it's not necessarily about how difficult something is or about how fun it is. There are a lot of subtler aesthetics that come into play. So here's a game called Shenzhen.io, which I've been playing this week. It's very fun if you like to program. And there's sort of two levels of activity that happen in this game. One of them is, hey, there's this assembly language where you're trying to program these little processors that can only have, either like 9 or 14 instructions in them. So you're trying to write programs that do useful work and fit them in there, and it's very hard. So you're like, oh, I need to make new nodes and communicate with them to try and build a more sophisticated program. But then, these nodes are big and bulky, and you have to like lay out these traces to do communication properly, and then you run out of space on the board, which changes shape from level to level, by the way. So this particular design, which one is, this is like I won't go into what it is, but basically there's 2 inputs on the left and 2 outputs on the right, and I'm trying to compute the right things for the outputs based on the inputs. You could imagine, hey, I'm going to make something that generates levels for this game by doing some kind of randomized process and tweaking the board layout until it seems hard by whatever heuristic or whatever. That by itself is a hard problem, and you could balance that way and be like, okay, well, it takes, the search finds the solution n% of the time, so that's the right level of difficulty or whatever. I don't know how you gauge fun, but you would still be missing something very subtle that's actually very important for game design, which is that the design of the game is sort of firing on 2 cylinders, right? So one of the, or pillars, I'm going to mix metaphors all over the place. One of the pillars of this game design is this sort of Tetris-y thing that you're doing with all the pieces. Like, oh, I had this bridge here, but then I need to put a chip here, so I need to move this, which means I need to rewrite this program to route that to a different pin, because the output pins are explicitly mentioned in the programs and all that, right? The other pillar is just optimizing the assembly program itself. Now, if you build a level that doesn't utilize both of those aspects of the game design, it's going to be kind of boring and blah and dumb, right? The game is really strong when both of those pistons of that engine are firing all the time. So for a game designer, tuning the game is not even necessarily about how hard it is. It's about how, it's about keeping the right fuel mixture in the game design to keep it in a sort of an optimal territory, right? So this is just to say that even in this game that would ostensibly not seem very rhetorical at all in terms of the actual, it actually is a little bit, but less so than sort of these 2D platformers that have explicit communication built into the level design. You still need to be guided by an aesthetic sense in order to tune the game. You can't just do it with functional requirements like how hard is it, right? Ideas of like how hard is a game are often what people will start with when they want to generate something, right? Like, well, what does game design school say? Your game's supposed to start easy when people are just learning it, and then get gradually harder, and then like have a climax at the end or something, right? But experienced game designers ignore all that stuff often when there are ideas that override that kind of a thing, right? So when I was designing The Witness, and actually in Braid as well, I didn't really care how hard any particular puzzle was, right? The games are structured much more by layout of ideas and surprise and creating elements of interestingness than by difficulty. Now, gauging difficulty in an AI process is probably a little bit hard, but gauging interest is really hard, right? But that's also like what intelligence is, right? So what I'm trying to say with all of this is that that's really what designers do. The part of game design that's like, making sure things are a certain level of difficulty or balance in terms of balancing numerical parameters is a minority of game design and not really what makes game design good, despite what they say in game design school. So last thing, hopefully it's the last thing. Yeah, pretty much. The last thing is that I don't believe that AI generation of game levels should be a forward-only process, wherein you start with, say you have some knowledge representation of ideas, what you want to do, and some way of translating that into level geometry, and then you do that and then you're done. I don't think that's right. So somebody who's designing a game sees how the elements come into play in the level and how they affect each other and how that changes the overall idea and feeling, right? So what we do when we design a level is we're looking at the gestalt of what we're doing and deciding if it's really succeeding or not, right? We're not even looking at isolated features and like, oh yeah, I'm making the guy jump really high there or whatever. We're looking at that jump in the context of everything around it, right? So the analogy that I have for level generation is it's kind of like a game of Go, where early when you're playing Go, there's not much on the board. You might put some stones down with expectations of what role you hope those stones will play later in the board, but then your opponent's going to do some stuff, and suddenly some stones that you thought were going to be great are like a liability or something, right? And so the situation is constantly changing. You need to evaluate the board as a whole, right? You can't just start with an intention, blast forward, and finish and say, ta-da, we did it, right? So, and the things that you need to assess are the semantics of the level, those very, very subtle things, like those 15 circled things and 1,000 spikes, right? Not the syntax, which is the easy part. Now you might say, well, humans say things all the time without really thinking about it. That's true for short utterances, but for longer form things, like a paragraph or a book or this speech, they get revised. So I think it's appropriate to consider a level design to sort of be a longer form utterance, usually, unless it's tiny. So now the last thing I have to say is, I've just talked about the importance of assessing the communication that your level design AI is imparting to a level as it puts features into the level. And as I assess my own communication of the speech, it seems to me that what might happen is what very often happens when I talk about things is it's very easy to, let's say the high concept of this was like, hey, treat level generation like natural language generation. And you might say, well, okay, well, natural language generation is just, you start with an idea, you build a sentence. Well, that's kind of what any level design process was, so this guy's talk is completely stupid because it's vacuous, right? The whole reason I'm up here talking for an hour is because I don't believe that this is vacuous. I do think it's subtle, and I would ask if you're going to go do this kind of thing to please at least take the natural language generation analogy seriously and see what it means for how you structure your code, right? Like what would I do if this was English instead of a game level? And what big guns do I need to take to the problem to make that kind of communication generation successful? Because it's not easy. I think that's everything. So thanks very much, everybody. I was rushing because I wanted to get done. I still didn't get done in time, so I'm a little bit over time. So I don't think we can do questions, but you can catch me out during the break or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah, great.
So we have a 15-minute break right now, and we'll come back in for the next session, Brian.
Folks who are in the next session, please feel free to come up and check out your laptop. The